kind of political fight between the Houthis and some other elements inside Yemen that basically devolved into an actual civil war. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE instantly jumped in on the side against the Houthis. The Houthis are backed by the Iranians, although the Iranians, as we now know, did not actually want the war to start. They urged the Houthis not to take the capital. Houthis went and did it anyway. That's how proxies work. Sometimes they do what you want, sometimes they don't. And so we backed Saudi and the UAE in their fight against the Houthis. That was the Obama administration. Then the Trump administration backed them as well. Biden ran on saying he was going to end this war.
And just to be clear, I just want to add that part I mentioned up front. I think it was Jake Sullivan at the time had said, like, or maybe it was Ben Rhodes after the fact, after the administration, like somewhere around 2017, 2018, I can't remember where he was interviewed, said, we thought if it was basically constructive engagement was the line. If we help the Saudis, we will be, as you put it, the guy on the bachelor party who's going to make sure things don't get out of control.
Yes, right, and that didn't happen. And then Trump showed up at the bachelor party, so the party raged for those 4 years. Biden comes in, and in his first foreign policy speech, he says we're going to end the war in Yemen, but then he adds this little clause where he says we're going to end support for offensive operations by Saudi Arabia. But of course, every power calls everything that they do defensive operations. So Saudi Arabia, when they're bombing inside Yemen, they're saying we're doing this to prevent Yemen from bombing us. Like, we have a defense department that has hundreds of bases around the world, but this is all defense.
Right.
When Israel is bombing Gaza, this is in Israel has a right to defend itself. So that became not terribly meaningful. And so there's been a ton of pressure in Congress on Biden to continue to restrict the help that we're giving the Saudis in their bombing. What shook everything up was wild. The Chinese came in and basically produced a détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It was shocking to the United States. So they're very concerned about losing their grip on the region. And out of that, then comes this deal that is brokered outside of the kind of UN and US framework that is proceeding along toward a peace deal. Now we've had a truce, we've had a ceasefire for about more than a year. It's expired, but it's still been a de facto ceasefire. And so once they got into this agreement between Iran, the Houthis, and Saudi Arabia, the U.S. started panicking. We instantly flew a bunch of envoys over to Riyadh to talk to Saudi Arabia to talk about how important it is that they're being inclusive and comprehensive. Those are the phrases they kept using: an inclusive and comprehensive government that would take over. What they mean by inclusive is to include a whole bunch of the U.S. proxies, because the U.S. still wants the ability to maintain significant control of the Yemen coastline, which is among the most important places in the entire world. We have our base there, right, in Djibouti, because this is the area that connects, the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea to the Suez Canal. An enormous amount of the world's oil and goods, flows through this area. So even though Yemen is totally poor and doesn't have any oil, it's just so strategically important that we want to make sure that we have control over enough areas of it that Iran is not able to, cause problems for us constantly. And the dynamics are that Saudi Arabia is happy with this ceasefire. They're not getting drones and missiles coming from Yemen into Saudi Arabia. So they have no real incentive to strike a final peace deal because they like things just as they are. But the Houthis are under a blockade. They can't get material, energy, food, medical supplies into the port of Hodeidah, into Aden. There are a few flights that have started up, but in general, they're still under this blockade. So time is working against the Houthis. So the longer you drag out these negotiations, the more likely it is that the Houthis play the only card they have, which is firing drones and missiles into Saudi Arabia and causing problems for them, because they're trying to be this, first world country with Messi playing football. They don't want a war, going around and like spooking all of these kind of rich Western people that they want to come to Saudi Arabia. So that's the card that the Houthis have to play. And so by the U.S. insisting that these talks get dragged out and continue to throw on more conditions and more obstacles in front of these talks, it seems like they're trying to push the Houthis to relaunch hostilities and then bring about the mother of all kind of bombing runs in retaliation, and then go back to the negotiating table a year later or whatever and say, look, remember how we wanted an inclusive peace? We want an inclusive peace. We get these islands, our people get this area over here by Djibouti, and now we're good. So the U.S. shockingly is like, as one person, Eric Sperling, said in my story, is more hawkish on this than Mohammed bin Salman. Like that, Saudi Arabia is ready to move on. This bloodthirsty, tyrannical nation is ready to move on from this war, and it's the U.S. is like, not yet.
The embargo that is taking place, or blockade, I guess, is really more accurate in terms of Yemen. Like, how is that being enforced?
The Saudis, and if we and with our help, we're helping, equip
logistic,
and
right?
maintain that.
But why can't the Saudis just basically say no? They can't pull, in their minds, they can't pull this blockade off until they have a finalized deal.
They can, and there are apparently big factions within Saudi Arabia that want to do that, and it is U.S. pressure that is pushing against them to do that. And so it's an interesting contrast and conflict for Saudi Arabia, because they're like, do we do the thing that is more in our interest, that we feel is more in our interest, which is lift the blockade, end this war? Like we're good. Like we're not. 8 years is enough of this war. Like that's where Saudi Arabia is at this point. Like they have other things they want to do in the world. The U.S. has different interests. Like they seem to want this to continue, so that they can get more control over this area in the long run. And so Saudi Arabia is in this interesting position of, do we do what's in the interest of the U.S. or do we do what's in our interests? Because if they do what's in their interest rather than ours, what are we going to do to them?
What leverage do we have?
Right.
As far as I can tell,
they might
none.
not want to. They might not want to find out. We're still a superpower. So it's a real Dirty Harry type of situation for kind of both parties. Like, if you remember that scene from Dirty Harry, it's when Clint Eastwood was like, did I shoot 5 bullets out of this gun, or did I shoot 6 bullets out of this gun? So you got to ask yourself, do you feel lucky?
Punk.
Yeah. And so
you've memorized that almost every line from every Clint Eastwood movie.
Right. So do we still have bullets in those chambers? Do they want to find out? Like, I think that's the question that they're asking themselves right now.
It's really and we should say, I mean, that conflict in Yemen has been horrific. It's been a horrific human tragedy. I mean, that for a long time we justified our involvement as a way of making sure that we could tighten the reins on Saudi Arabia. And it sounds like maybe that's not true.
Yeah. It's about that straight. It's about that straight.
It always seemed a little bit
and
dubious.
Iran. I mean,
right.
And it comes down to the United States' obsessive rivalry with Iran.
I wonder how much of like the failure of the Biden administration to get back into the Iran deal has contributed to this. I mean,
huge.
And this again was something that they could have done immediately, but there was too much of a fear of looking weak relative to Iran. Those are the two big lessons I think that they didn't learn supposedly from the Obama years, was that, the best thing I think Obama did in terms of foreign policy was that Iran deal. And somehow they were afraid that Fox News was going to say that Biden was too apologetic or something.
Yep. And the tragedy and the irony, and this has been consistent since basically U.S. foreign policy since World War II, is that we always think that these like actors, because the Houthis aren't like an official government yet, aren't necessarily hostile to us, when in fact you could, a lot of these governments that we like cooed and like launched death squads against would actually just have been happy to work with us.
Of course.
Like the Houthis, if we go into the Houthis with like $1 billion, they'd be like, yeah, do whatever you want with that strait. Run as many oil tankers as you want through it. Just don't bomb us. And help us with some humanitarian relief. And Iran's not going to stop that.
But what inhibits the ability of the American foreign policy apparatus from understanding that? I mean, it seems to me it has to be there are corporate interests that are associated, that have interests in that region, that for them in particular, maybe not overall, but for their particular interests, they see a threat in having, this type of full control by whatever party it is. And they have an outsized influence on that foreign policy. I mean, I think that more often than not, the incentives right where the rubber meets the road, those people have the greatest stakes in it. At least from their perspective, coming with the resources and access, and that's what dictates these policies.
And to that end, the only thing I can think is that we're just not comfortable in not even an equal kind of diplomatic relationship, but any relationship that is anything other than, boot on the neck.
Right.
So how is it that the non-aligned movement, throughout the 70s and 80s, was perceived by us as a threat? Like the people who were literally saying, look, we're not with the Soviets, we're not with the communists, but we're also not 100% like anti-communist. But we want to work with both sides, and we love the United States, we love all of American pop culture and culture, no beef here. And we went around and overthrowing those governments and chopping those people up. And why? And the only reason you can think of is that they're just not comfortable with anything other than a with us attitude. Like you're either with us or against us.
It's the paranoia of a bloated superpower that only knows how to exert its might through military means. And especially with this happening with the backdrop of China now dipping its toes into diplomacy, whether it be with, Saudi Arabia or their meeting, I guess, with Putin, was it a few weeks ago? They're trying to encroach on that kind of flexing of muscle on the world stage, but they are just doing it in a way that's more soft powery. And that, I think concerns the U.S., but we don't adjust our approach ever. We're just still the hammer and the nail.
Right. Right. I mean, Lumumba, even if you remember, called the UN as we in the Dutch are on the way to butchering him. To the end of his life, he thought that he could ally with us. We'd be friends with him. Who was the UN, the head of the UN that the CIA helped South Africa shoot out of the sky? The UN is not a member of the communist bloc. You have to just show 100% fealty.
I'm convinced it's a function of capitalism and big capital's influence on the process. Rather than a national psyche. I mean, because the Chinese understand, and they've been investing in Africa for decades now. And their whole strategy has been we'll come in and help you build roads. And and I think it's because they can operate in their own interest as a sovereign nation without having their policies a function of interest, of narrow financial interests in these situations. And I think that has, I think that is the, if you have enough guns for a while, hopefully, I guess not hopefully, but I'm saying from the perspective of the country, if you have enough guns and military might, making strategic decisions based upon narrow corporate interests, can work out for you, but only for so long, I would imagine.
And I think, and bureaucratically also, it comes back to the safety in a decision. Like if you're the bureaucrat, the diplomat who's like, let's just work with the Houthis in this. Like they won, let's do it. If that's not going to go 100% perfectly. Like they're detaining some of our staff at the embassy currently, and so like let's say they detain some more. They do something else, horrific. Now you're the diplomat who like suggested working with these goons, and when our goons do horrific things, that's okay. Like they can chop up a Washington Post columnist, and we'll get over it. But if the other goons do something, then that is a reflection of a completely failed foreign policy. And what were you thinking? We need confrontation.
It's a great piece of reporting, and I hope I hope it gets widely read, and then that the New York Times steals it from you and reprints it under their byline, and so that we can get even more attention to it. But we will put a link to that piece over at the Intercept entitled "The Yemen War Can Be Over If Biden Wants It." Ryan, always a pleasure.